In the spring of 1937, in a side room of the Vienna City Archives, a clerk sorting uncatalogued glass plates pulls a cracked negative from a grey envelope, labelled only Prater, 1870s. The image is simple, a temporary exhibition hall from the 1873 Vienna World's Fair, its iron ribs cutting across a pale sky. But in the foreground, half in shadow, stands a row of bells, enormous dark bronze forms, mounted not in a church tower, but on adjustable iron frames, flanked by dials and cables that look more like laboratory equipment than liturgical fittings. The official catalogue for that fair lists industrial art and acoustic instruments. Yet no entry describes a battery of test-mounted bells. The marginal caption, added in a later hand, simply reads, "Resonance experiments, pavilion demolished." On the plate, a faint flare of light crosses one bell's waist like a frozen vibration. The clerk notes the plate number, then moves on. History remembers the fair as a monument to progress, but rarely asks what its new machines replaced. By May 1873, Vienna presents itself to the world as a laboratory of empire. The World's Fair in the Prater is officially dedicated to culture and education, its centrepiece the vast rotund, a circular hall crowned by one of the largest domes ever built. According to official reports, the fair showcases industry, art and science, steam engines, precision clocks, musical instruments, and models of distant cities. The catalogues treat sound as accompaniment, military bands, orchestras, the murmur of international visitors, not as an exhibit in itself. Yet some panoramic photographs show something else. In the shadow of the rotund's dome, large bronze bells are displayed alongside boilers and turbines, grouped under headings like foundry products and metallurgical arts. Their captions mention weight and alloy, never frequency. A fair worker later recalled, "The big hall had corners where you could feel the sound press against your chest when everything was ringing at once." Whether he meant the bands or the bells is unclear. The archive offers no clarification, only the quote in a TypeScript interview. In the official narrative, the rotund is celebrated for its unprecedented span. Acousticians note quietly that such a dome focuses sound in distinct hotspots. Today, the rotund is gone, destroyed by fire in 1937. But its footprint still shapes the exhibition grounds. Stand there on a misty morning, and distant church bells bleed faintly through traffic noise, pooling in the open circle where a dome once gathered every echo. In a cathedral archive in Roseau, Dominica, a ledger entry dated simply 1873 records the arrival of new bells from London. Two surviving inscriptions on the bronze confirm the source. Mears and Steinbank Foundry, London, 1873, St. George. Officially, these bells are replacements, functional instruments for calling parishioners, marking hours, and sounding funerals. Bell-founding manuals of the era describe their making in precise terms, ratios of copper to tin, profiles calculated to produce a particular musical note when struck, and careful tuning by shaving metal from the inner lip. A note in the cathedral's restoration papers, much later, preserves one remark from a local. When the London bells came, people said the air itself felt different when they rang. The sick asked to be moved closer to hear them. Whether this is memory or myth, the archive does not say. On arrival, the bells are hoisted into a stone tower whose height, measured today, happens to be almost exactly 4 times its width, a proportion that turns up in many early bell towers and is argued by some modern researchers to have acoustic advantages. On humid evenings, warm air thickens the sound. The bell's fundamental tones blend with the surf and the insect buzz of the surrounding hills, producing a layered resonance felt more in the body than the ear. Contemporary historians file the Roseau bells under colonial ecclesiastical history, modern sound healing practitioners, listening to recordings, speak instead of therapeutic overtones. Between those two explanations, a small contradiction opens, not in dates, but in intent. In 1862, German physicist Hermann von Helmholtz publishes On the Sensations of Tone, introducing a device that will quietly transform how sound is understood. The Helmholtz resonator, a hollow sphere with a small opening that sings at a single frequency when exposed to complex sounds. 2 decades later, Lord Rayleigh examines the acoustical properties of bells, analysing their complex partials and vibrational modes. In the late 19th century, his studies on bell acoustics mark one of the first systematic attempts to understand why some bells sound pure, while others beat and shimmer. Official histories present these as separate tracks: physics on laboratory benches, bell founders in smoky workshops, churches on distant hillsides. But in Rayleigh's diagrams, a curious visual echo appears. The drawn bell profiles and the schematic Helmholtz cavities share a principle: a volume of air coupled to the outside world through a narrowing neck, tuned to respond strongly at specific frequencies. In both, resonance is not an accident, but a design. A letter from one bell founder to a client hints at practical application. We have adjusted the form to diminish discordant upper tones and to favour the deep note that calms the ear. Whether he ever read Helmholtz is unknown, yet the language of calming creeps into a trade that officially sells timekeeping and ceremony. The laboratories where glass spheres hum under controlled conditions are cool, lit by northern windows. The foundries are hot, filled with the roar of furnaces. Between them, a shared idea vibrates. That air, confined and released, can be made to carry not just sound, but mood. Today, the same equations used for Helmholtz resonators guide the tuning of exhaust systems and loudspeaker ports, industrial descendants of a 19th century obsession with resonance. In survey notes compiled for a recent study on sacred acoustics, a researcher remarks almost in passing that close to 80% of early bell towers surveyed show a height-to-width ratio near 4:1. No 19th century architectural manual mandates this proportion. Official design text emphasize style, structural stability, and cost. Yet from Western Europe to Latin America, towers built between the 17th and 19th centuries repeatedly fall into this same geometric rhythm. Measured on site, a stone campanile in Italy, a brick tower in Central Europe, and a stuccoed belfry in the Caribbean all land at that 4:1 figure within the margin of construction irregularities. Their bells vary in size and age. Their proportions hum with sameness. A restorer working on an old tower wrote in a margin note, "The space inside amplifies certain notes. Whisper at the base and you hear it halfway up." The comment was never intended as theory, only as a practical warning about noise. Alternative history enthusiasts reading modern acoustic studies speculate that such proportions might turn towers into giant tuned cavities, vertical Helmholtz resonators coupled to their surrounding towns. Official scholarship remains cautious. No document from the time states such an intent. In one 19th century drawing, the date under a tower plan is smudged, legible as either 1873 or 1878, depending on how the ink is read. Catalogues list the finished structure under the later date, while a dedication plaque names the earlier year. Archivists usually call this a clerical error. Others, less satisfied, see it as another small temporal crack. On foggy mornings, when the bells ring, the sound climbs the shaft of air and spills out over slate roofs in a pattern no archive describes, but everyone in the town unconsciously learns. Long before modern sound therapy enters wellness clinics, bells are already tied to ideas of protection and health. Older sources describe bells rung to ward off storms, drive away demons, and cleanse the air of pestilence. In some traditions, their sound is believed to have a beneficial effect on human health, alleviating illness or purifying the surrounding space. By the 19th century, official church documents emphasize their liturgical roles, calls to prayer, markers of time, but parish records and local law preserve another layer. One village account notes, during the fever, the old bell was rung at dawn and dusk. People said its voice eased the chest. Modern articles on sound healing echo these older beliefs, arguing that large bells can slow brain waves into more relaxed states and that their low-frequency waves are felt throughout the body, promoting calm and sometimes framed as healing. Scientific evidence is limited and cautious, but the subjective testimonies accumulate. A small contradiction emerges between eras, where earlier communities speak openly of beneficent power. Later, liturgical texts grow spare, as if embarrassed by such claims. The bell's healing becomes folk belief, not doctrine. Recordings made inside certain towers carry a curious acoustic detail. After each strike, once the main tone decays, a faint, almost electrical hiss lingers in the silence, microphones picking up wind, stone reflections, and perhaps the low rumble of urban infrastructure. To some ears, it sounds like static, to others, like the bell's after image. Standing in a cold nave after evening mass, you can feel the last vibrations in the wooden pews, long after the official ringing schedule has ended. During the First World War, metal shortages lead governments to requisition non-ferrous metals. Church bells, made of bronze rich in copper and tin, are taken down and melted for artillery. In some regions, campaigns specifically target 19th and 20th century bells as wartime material. Older, historically significant bells are often spared. A similar pattern repeats under Nazi occupation. Between 1939 and 1945, vast numbers of bells are confiscated across Europe, graded from A, recent, expendable, to D, older, to be preserved. Tens of thousands of younger bells vanish into smelters, their inscriptions erased, their frequencies recast as weapons. One curator later wrote, "We were told to list everything, but not to question which bells were to be spared." In some parishes, communities secretly bury select bells, hoping to preserve at least one familiar voice. This wartime sorting introduces a brutal filter into bell history. Many bells cast in the decades around 1870 survive only if someone argued for their artistic or memorial value. Others disappear without a trace, leaving only gaps in ledgers where inventory numbers once stood. Alternative researchers look at these absences and see design. If bells carried specific acoustic properties, beneficial or otherwise, then systematically removing an entire generation could be read as more than simple resource extraction. Mainstream historians see strategic metal mobilization, not targeted silencing. Both interpretations share the same documents. In a few cities today, memorial bells explicitly commemorate the thousands melted for war, inscribed with phrases such as, "I speak with the voice of 1,000 bells silenced by war." The silence that follows a bell removed is itself a kind of resonance, an absence people continue to feel. Acoustic studies of ancient and medieval buildings note an odd feature. Ceramic pots and cavities embedded in walls and vaults, positioned to act as resonators that subtly shape the sound field experiments. Comparing these acoustic pots to Helmholtz resonators show that, when tuned correctly, they can amplify or dampen specific frequencies in a room. Cathedrals and churches, especially those with prominent bell towers, thus become not just visual monuments but complex acoustic devices, with bells as their most obvious moving parts and hidden cavities as their quiet regulators. Official architectural descriptions focus on style: Gothic, Baroque, neoclassical. Rarely do they mention that a whisper in one gallery can be heard clearly across the nave, or that a certain corner seems to throb softly when the main bell tolls. A 19th century sacristan, quoted in a local chronicle, notes, "There is a place by the south wall where the bells sound louder than at the door. The old men say the wall is hollow there." Modern acousticians, armed with microphones and simulation software, map the sound fields, confirming that certain tower shapes and internal cavities concentrate low frequencies, yet they hesitate to ascribe intentional healing design motives to the original builders. Correlation is not proof. In this gap between effect and documented intent, speculative history enters. What if bell towers were tuned not only to be heard across distance, but also to stimulate particular bodily responses in those who lived within their reach? Outside, on a cold, clear night, the air is crisp, and the bell's note feels sharper, more penetrating. Inside the tower stairwell, the same note becomes a physical vibration through stone and bone, a private experiment in resonance, conducted unconsciously by anyone climbing the steps. Contemporary science agrees on one point: sound influences human physiology. Music can slow heart rate, alter breathing, and modulate brainwave patterns. Certain frequency ranges are routinely used in clinical and wellness settings to promote relaxation and sleep. In recent decades, specific tunings, notably 432 Hz instead of the standard 440 Hz, have gained a quasi-mythic reputation as healing frequencies. Some small modern studies report modest differences in vital parameters and perceived anxiety when participants listen to music tuned to 432 Hz rather than 440 Hz than 440 Hz, though evidence is still tentative and far from miraculous. Despite this, a large subculture of practitioners and listeners insist that certain tones feel more aligned with the body when applied retroactively to bells. These ideas take on a particular allure. Bell partials rarely land on neat proportional frequencies. Their spectra are messy, rich, and full of beating intervals. Yet listeners often describe specific bells as comforting, penetrating, or unsettling. Qualitative language that overlaps with modern therapeutic discourse. A 19th century bell description might praise a bell for its noble, healthful sound, while a 21st century sound healer speaks of cellular regeneration and nervous system reset. Under its tones, the vocabulary changes. The experiential claim is oddly similar. In one field recording made on a chilly evening, a distant bell tolls slowly while street noise passes underneath. Between strikes, what remains on the tape is a soft rumble around the threshold of hearing, wind, traffic, or the building's own sympathetic vibrations. Some listeners swear they feel their breathing deepen just hearing this residue. Science measures decibels and heart rate. Tradition speaks of blessings and cures. Between them, the bell continues to ring. In the early 21st century, online communities revive an older geographic term, Tartaria or Tartari, and weave it into a global narrative of a lost technologically advanced civilization responsible for much of the world's 18th and 19th century monumental architecture. Mainstream historians identify this as pseudo-history, noting that Tartarian Empire claims ignore well-documented regional histories. Yet within this framework, bell towers, domes, and elaborate 19th century fairgrounds acquire new meaning. Temporary exhibition buildings, rail terminals, and cathedrals are reinterpreted as components of a global frequency network, allegedly using resonance to heal, energize, or control populations. Images circulate of large bronze bells, sometimes labeled healing bells of Tartaria, accompanied by speculation that they destroyed many bells after World War II because sound is healing. Discussions link these bells to star-shaped fortifications, onion domes, and rotundas, tracing a visual pattern more than a documented technological system. A typical comment reads, "Many bells of the old culture were destroyed, buried, and replaced to hide the importance of acoustic resonance. Cathedrals were healing centers, the bells were the transmitters." Academic critiques emphasize the lack of archival evidence for such a unified system. Still, the patterns enthusiasts point to are real. Similar domes and bell towers appear in distant cities within a few decades of each other, photographed with streets still half mud, half cobblestone. Whether one sees this as a sign of a hidden empire or of rapid global industrialization, the visual repetition is striking. Under cloudy skies, bronze bells hang in stone shells of familiar proportions, their frequencies unrecorded, their original makers mostly anonymous. The term healing bells of Tartaria thus names less a documented artifact than a contemporary attempt to give language to a sensed coherence, a feeling that these bells once did more than mark the hour. The year 1873 sits quietly in most history books, a major financial panic, the Vienna World's Fair, and, in a Caribbean cathedral ledger, the casting date of two London bells. Alternative researchers splice these threads into a different montage. In their reconstructions, 1873 becomes a synchronization point, a year in which new bells, towers, and domes, from Vienna's exhibition grounds to colonial churches, are installed or dedicated in unusual density. The Vienna Fair's vast dome is read as a central node. Far-flung bell towers as peripheral resonators feed in a planetary grid. Mainstream records do not support such a networked design. The fair was heavily photographed and documented, but no surviving blueprint mentions healing frequencies or an acoustic system beyond the practical needs of crowds and concerts. Still, small archival oddities fuel speculation. A miscopied date in one tower's records, a photograph of test-mounted bells with laboratory apparatus whose purpose is poorly explained, a restoration note mentioning resonance experiments with no further detail. Individually, they are footnotes. Together, they form the skeleton of a different story. In that speculative narrative, the Roseau bells are not just colonial imports, but part of a coordinated rollout. London foundries casting tuned devices shipped to nodes across the globe in the same decade that acousticians formalized the science of resonance. On a warm evening today, when those 1873 bells ring over the harbour, their tones mix with radio static, car engines, and electronic notification chimes, new frequencies layered onto old. Official chronologies describe progress, speculative ones describe patterns. Both, in different ways, are attempts to tune time. The Vienna Rotund, so proudly built for the 1873 fair, burns to the ground in 1937. In photographs of the fire, the Great Dome collapses in a storm of sparks, leaving only twisted iron and blackened masonry. The acoustic properties that once concentrated voices and music into a single vast volume vanish into smoke. 2 world wars later, much of Europe's bell soundscape is likewise irrevocably altered. In some regions, nearly half the bells are lost to requisitioning and bombing. In others, bells are silenced by decree, permitted to ring only in case of invasion. An eyewitness from a German town recalled, when they took the bells down, the tower felt empty. The silence was not quiet, it was loud in the chest. The line appears in a post-war oral history, one among many accounts of absence. In occupied territories, church bells cast after 1860 are particularly targeted as replaceable, their relative youth making them expendable in the eyes of requisition committees. Many of these include bells cast in the 1870s, their workshops documented, their inscriptions recorded once, then melted. Alternative narratives interpret this focus on younger bells as evidence of deliberate erasure of a specific frequency generation. Historians counter that the logic was pragmatic. Newer bells were more plentiful and less likely to be listed as heritage objects. Both views read the same policy documents. Their conclusions differ. In city squares today, scattered bronze fragments and restored replacements hint at what was lost. Memorial bells speak of the thousands taken and melted, their new tones mingling remembrance with replacement. The wars did more than destroy metal. They broke the continuity of listening, a centuries-long habit of living inside specific sound fields. Today, in cities across the world, bronze bells still ring from towers built in the 18th and 19th centuries. Some were cast in 1873, others replaced wartime losses. Still others are modern instruments tuned with computer-assisted precision. Their sound washes over glass facades, satellite dishes, and fibre optic cables. Standing in a narrow street at dusk, you can hear layers: the main strike, the decaying hum, the faint rattle of windows, the low mechanical drone of traffic, and, beneath it all, a nearly inaudible flutter of electrical interference from nearby power lines and radio antennas. The acoustic and electromagnetic environments have merged, but the bell still sits at their intersection. Architecture, too, repeats itself. New civic buildings rise with domes and towers reminiscent of older styles. Their proportions echo in patterns established centuries ago. Most are justified in planning documents as aesthetic choices or heritage references, not as components of any acoustic system, yet their forms continue to shape how sound moves through space. Meanwhile, on screens and forums, the idea of healing bells of Tartaria circulates as a story about what might have been. A civilization that understood frequency as medicine, whose bells were tuned not only to call, but to mend, and whose technologies were systematically dismantled and forgotten. Historians remind us that Tartaria, as an empire, never existed as described in such tales. Its bells are metaphors built on misread maps and photographs, and yet the emotional core of that myth, that something about our old soundscapes has been lost, that certain tones once bound communities in ways we no longer fully feel, is harder to dismiss. It is written not in manifestos, but in diary entries, marginal notes, and the way people speak of their bell, decades after it has fallen silent. In archives, we find dates, foundry names, and technical drawings. In the air between towers and streets, we find a different record, continually overwritten, yet never entirely erased. History remembers progress, but forgets what it replaced. The film grain thickens, the image of a bronze bell, half lit in a dusty tower, freezes mid-swing. The soundtrack holds its last vibrating note a moment too long. then cuts to silence, as if the reel ended one frame early, leaving the frequency to continue, unheard, just beyond the edge.